Welcome back to World Cup History. My name is Lavender Bai and I am your World Cup historian. Somebody call John Travolta because welcome to the 60s, baby.
Hey mama, welcome to the 60s!
June 2nd, 1962 to be precise. This time we are in Santiago, Chile. 60,000 people pack into the stands for the second match of the tournament to watch Chile take on Italy. The BBC has flown the footage of the match back to London. This takes 2 whole days to arrive, and when it does, David Coleman sits down in front of a camera to introduce it to British viewers.
The game you're about to see is the most stupid, appalling, disgusting and disgraceful exhibition of football possibly in the history of the game. Chile versus Italy. This is the first time the two countries have met. We hope it will be the last. The national motto of Chile reads, "By reason or by force." Today, the Chileans were prepared to be reasonable. The Italians only used force. And the result was a disaster for the World Cup. Now, if the World Cup is going to survive in its present form, something's got to be done about teams that play like this. Indeed, after seeing the film tonight, you at home may well think that teams that play in this manner ought to be expelled immediately from the competition. Just see what you think.
And he would not be exaggerating. A player is sent off within the first 4 minutes of kickoff. Within 12 seconds of kickoff, a foul has been committed. Chileans spat in the face of Italians, Italians kicked the Chileans, a Chilean winger delivered a left hook to an Italian defender's face that would have made Muhammad Ali proud. Naturally, the Italian defender responded by kicking him in the head with a flying boot. Police were called onto the pitch 4 times. The referee later said, "I wasn't refereeing a football match. I was directing military maneuvers." Ultimately, Chile win 2-0, sending the Italians packing. This is the story of the 1962 World Cup. But first, we need to go back to the turn of the decade and the worst day in Chilean history. It is a Saturday in Chile on May 21st, 1960. Most people are preparing for the traditional commemoration of the Battle of Iquique, a national holiday marking the naval battle that Chile lost against Peru during the War of the Pacific in the 19th century. Things seemed normal, and then all of a sudden they were anything but. At 6:02 local time, the first earthquake strikes, a massive 8.1 magnitude, with the epicenter being just south of Concepcion. This causes significant damage and prompts President Jorge Alessandri to cancel the Battle of Iquique memorial ceremony to oversee the emergency relief. 3 more strong aftershocks would follow in the next 3 hours, magnitudes between 6.5 and 6.8. Many buildings that were damaged in the first shock end up collapsing during the 6.8 aftershock at 6:53 a.m. The coastal area between Aruco and Lebu is uplifted by more than a meter. People spend the night outside. They don't go back inside. Something feels wrong, something just feels off, and they know it. And boy, oh boy, were they onto something, because it only gets worse from here. Okay, so now it's Sunday, May 22nd. 6:32 a.m., a 7.1 magnitude earthquake strikes. This time, the epicenter has migrated further south. And then at 2:55 local time, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake strikes. This is just 15 minutes before the main event. And then at 3:11 p.m. local time, a 500-mile length of fault ruptures, starting from offshore near the Aruco Peninsula and propagating south at 2.2 miles per second. This was the big one, 9.5 magnitude. The energy released is estimated to be equivalent to 20,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. This is the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in human history. So powerful that it tilts the Earth's axis so bad that it shortens the days that we have experienced since. A tsunami follows, with waves up to 25 meters high hitting the Chilean coast within minutes. This tsunami would be so big it travels across the Pacific, reaching Hawaii and Japan, killing people in both countries. 2 million people are left homeless, with nearly 60,000 buildings destroyed and nearly 2,000 lives lost. For obvious reasons, nobody is thinking about the upcoming 1962 World Cup at this point. But as we know on this channel, we are always thinking about the World Cup. Chile was already preparing to host the 1962 tournament after having won the bid against Argentina 2 years earlier. Against Argentina's superior infrastructure and greater footballing pedigree, Chile's one weapon was a guy named Carlos Ditborn, the charismatic president of the Chilean Football Association. His argument to FIFA was simple. Argentina could build a World Cup. Chile needed one. His campaign to FIFA was powerful. Quote, "Because we have nothing, we will do everything." He also played a bit of a reverse card, using FIFA's own self-appointed function of using the World Cup to promote football in less developed countries and handing it back to them. FIFA ultimately would vote 32-11 in favor of Chile. But if they thought they had nothing when they secured the bid, by the end of May 1960, that nothing would have felt awfully gluttonous now. 2 million people were out of a home, towns and cities were devastated. The earthquake prompted Ditborn to meet with Chilean President Jorge Alessandri and offer to return the public funds given to the organizing committee. But Alessandri refused. The president felt the people's spirits needed to be lifted after going through such a traumatic experience. The earthquakes destroyed many cities that were meant to host World Cup matches. The planned 8 host cities were very quickly reduced to 4, and Ditborn worked relentlessly. He rarely took a day off or heeded the advice of his doctors to rest. The incessant fixation on making sure Chile would host the World Cup would ultimately lead to his deteriorating health. On April 28, 1962, just 1 month before the opening match, Carlos Ditborn died suddenly. He was only 41 years old. He never saw the tournament he had saved, and the Chilean national team players wore a black stripe taped under their badge throughout the tournament in his honor. One of the stadiums would eventually be renamed Estadio Carlos Ditborn in his honor. Ultimately, the World Cup would go on without him. 57 nations entered qualifying for this World Cup, with only 16 making it to Chile. We've got 2 debutants this year in Colombia and Bulgaria. Colombia had qualified by beating Peru in a playoff. They were drawn in Group 1 alongside 2-time world champions Uruguay, European champions the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. Nobody gave them a chance. In their group game against the Soviet Union, Colombia went 3-0 down inside the first half, then 4-1 down in the 57th minute. But then something remarkable happened. Colombia scored 3 goals to make it 4-4, and in the process, Marcos Cole scored directly from the corner for the first time in World Cup history. A ball struck so sweetly from the corner arc that it curved directly into the net without anyone touching it. Against the European champions. This was huge. This was their first World Cup and they're already making a name for themselves. Ultimately, they would still go home in the group stage and they didn't qualify for another World Cup until 1990. As for the notable absentees from this tournament, Sweden, the 1958 hosts and finalists, failed to qualify for this one. France, the 1958 semi-finalists, where Just Fontaine scored 13 goals, also failed to qualify. The 2 teams that had made the semi-final in the previous tournament were both watching from home. We also have no Asia and no Africa in this World Cup. 10 countries from Europe, 1 Central American country, and 5 South American countries, including Uruguay, who went home in the group stage, the most storied team in the history of the tournament, eliminated by the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. But before the World Cup came 2 Italian journalists with a great deal to say about the place. So before the draw, 2 Italian journalists named Antonio Garelli and Corrado Pisanelli visited Chile, writing dispatches from Santiago that described the city as a backwater dump where, quote, "the phones don't work, taxis are as rare as faithful husbands, a cable to Europe costs an arm and a leg, and a letter takes 5 days to turn up. And its population as prone to, quote, malnutrition, illiteracy, alcoholism, and poverty." La Nacion called Santiago, quote, "a stinking slum." Pisanelli was harsher still, describing Chile as, quote, "a country of prostitutes, beggars, and illiterates." Mind you, Chile had just endured the worst earthquake in reported history. So give them a break, guys. These 2 journalists left Chile before the World Cup kicked off, fearing for their own safety. But their articles stayed in the public conscious. Chilean newspapers fired back, radio stations fanned the flames, and by the time Italian players landed, they carried the weight of every word published back home. When Italian players took to the pitch, Chileans were ready to seek justice. June 2, 1962, the group stage. Chile versus Italy. 66,000 fans pack out Estadio Nacional after Chile had beaten Switzerland 3-1 in their opener. Italy had drawn 0-0 with West Germany. Whoever won this would almost certainly reach the quarterfinals. There was everything to play for on the pitch, and off the pitch, even more to play for. From the start, Chileans spat in the faces of Italians, poked and kicked and provoked. When the Italians retaliated, it was they who were punished. The first foul was awarded after 12 seconds. Italian Giorgio Farini was sent off in the 8th minute, and he refused to leave the pitch. The referee had to call the police, and Farini was eventually escorted off by 2 officers. Italy were down to just 10 men before the game had even properly started. Shortly before halftime, Chilean winger Lionel Sanchez was fouled by Italian defender Mario David. Sanchez was the son of a professional boxer and responded by delivering a left hook to David's face. As you do. He escaped punishment entirely, despite the incident happening just meters from the linesman. David took matters into his own hands just minutes later and hit Sanchez with a flying boot to the head. Referee Ken Aston sent him off immediately, meaning that Italy were down to just 9 men with more than a half of a game remaining. Sanchez would go on to escape punishment again later, flooring Italian captain Umberto Maschio with a left hook, breaking his nose. The referee claims he had his back to it, and the linesman apparently saw it but didn't flag it. Chilean police would have to intervene 4 times in the second half. Italy would hang on as best as they could with just 9 men, but Chile would ultimately score twice, sending them home. And Ken Aston walked off the pitch saying he had been directing military maneuvers. After the match, Italians were banned from bars and restaurants and supermarkets across Chile. Their training camp was put under armed guard. That is how intense this was. The early days of football, let me tell you. But I want to talk about Ken Aston for a second, because he went home to England and became the head of referees for the 1966 World Cup. At the 1966 tournament, an England player named Jack Charlton was surprised to read in the newspapers that he had been cautioned during a match. The referee had not publicly indicated it. No one had known. So the thing is, warnings up until this point were given verbally in the referee's native language and often understood by no one. So Aston was driving home from Wembley one night when he stopped at a traffic light on High Street. The light turned red and he said, "I thought yellow means caution, red means stop. You're off the field." He went home and his wife Hilda disappeared and came back with 2 homemade cards made of construction paper, a yellow one and a red one. And so yellow and red cards were introduced at the 1970 World Cup in Mexico and have been used in every match at every level of football ever since. They've spread across codes and they are now a universal visual language understood in any country, in any language, and by any player or spectator on earth. So the referee who couldn't control the Battle of Santiago gave football the tool that tries to prevent the next one. Heading into 1962, everything pointed to this being Pele's World Cup. He was 21 years old. 4 years earlier, he had been the prodigy, the crying teenager who had won it at 17 and barely understood what had happened. Now, he was the finished article, the complete forward, the best player on the planet with a point to prove on the biggest stage. In Brazil's first game of the tournament against Mexico, Pelé assisted the first goal and then scored the second himself, dribbling past 4 defenders before finishing. He hinted in interviews that Chile 1962 would be his World Cup. The second group game was against Czechoslovakia, and midway through the first half, Pelé fell to the ground. He had torn a muscle in his thigh. There were no substitutions in 1962. If Pelé went off, Brazil would play the rest of the match with 10 men. And so he stayed on, limping heavily, clearly incapacitated, and hanging out on the wing, unable to contribute. It was so bad that the Czechoslovakian players apparently went easy on him. And ultimately, Brazil would somehow stumble their way to a 0-0 draw. The best player in the world spent the second half of that match essentially standing on the pitch doing nothing, unable to come off because the rules of the era gave him no alternative. Brazil knew by full time that their tournament had changed completely. The final group game against Spain saw Pelé replaced by Amarildo, a man with a far less exciting reputation. But ultimately, Amarildo scored twice, and Brazil would win 2-1. And honestly points to him. Being called up as the cover for the best player in the world and being able to keep Brazil's World Cup alive, build him the statue already. Pelé would watch the rest of the tournament from the bench. He got to play 2 group games, one brilliant and one virtually useless. That was his 1962 World Cup. Up until that moment, Garrincha had always been exceptional, but had always kind of been in Pelé's shadow. Pelé was the name, Pelé was the superstar. Garrincha was brilliant, sure, but he was never the main attraction. The moment that Pelé went down against Czechoslovakia, everything shifted. Garrincha stepped into the spotlight and it changed everything. Not just for the tournament, but for his legacy and his life. So years later, when Neymar was injured and ruled out of Brazil's 2014 World Cup campaign, Pelé posted on social media saying, quote, "I was also injured during the 1962 World Cup in Chile, and I was out for the rest of the tournament. But God helped Brazil continue to win the championship. I hope the same will happen." Spoiler alert, it didn't happen for Brazil in 2014. But in 1962, without their best player, it was now Garrincha's tournament. Garrincha was not in peak physical form in 1962. His knees were giving him trouble, he was heavily drinking, his personal life was chaotic as all hell, and by any conventional measure, he should not have been the best player at a World Cup. But he was anyway. He gave a series of outstanding performances across every match. Every game, he was undoubtedly the best player on the pitch. Every game, he was tormenting defenders, creating chances, and scoring goals. The crowds adored him. Garrincha was exceptional, but he was always in Pelé's shadow. And the moment that Pelé went down against Czechoslovakia, Garrincha stepped up, and it changed everything. And he didn't even play differently. He always played the same way, but now the spotlight was entirely on him, and he thrived under it. Then came England in the quarterfinals. Brazil beat England 3-1, Garrincha scoring twice and assisting the other. One match report described him as appearing to dribble past defenders as if they were traffic cones. England had no answer for him. He simply did whatever he wanted on the pitch. But this match is also remembered for something else entirely. A stray dog ran onto the pitch and evaded every attempt to catch it. Players, officials, goalkeepers, nobody can get a hold of this dog. Then English striker Jimmy Greaves, who is a known dog lover, gets down on his hands and knees and calls the dog over. The crowd goes wild. They love this. He picks it up and you think it's going to be the sweetest moment ever. And then the dog proceeds to piss all over his white England shirt. Graves had to play the rest of the match in it. One shirt per game was the rules in 1962. There were no substitutes and no change of kit. So Garrincha had scored twice in this game and had obviously found this whole saga hilarious. He ends up adopting the dog. England go home smelling of literal dog piss, Garrincha gets a dog, and Brazil goes to the semifinals. And so we're at the semifinal. Brazil versus Chile, the host nation. The country that had survived the earthquake, buried its organizer, and reached the last four. 66,000 people pack out the stadium, and it's a noise like nothing else. Garrincha scores twice, and Brazil were winning. And then, with 83 minutes on the clock, it happened. For 83 minutes, Chilean defenders had fouled him, kicked him, and provoked him. So opponents knew the only way to stop him was to hurt him. And usually, he always resisted retaliation. But everyone has their breaking point, and in the 83rd minute, Garrincha was spotted in an off-the-ball incident, kneeing an opponent, and was sent off. Ultimately, Brazil won 4-2, but automatic suspension meant the best player in the tournament, the only reason they were still in it, would miss the final. The Brazilian public were devastated. Brazilian officials called in every favor available within governments and football to lobby on their behalf. In the end, the referee said he didn't see the foul directly and was relying on the word of his linesman, who had since left the country. Garrincha was cleared to play. The man who carried Brazil through the tournament, the man who adopted a dog that pissed on the English goalkeeper, the man who had one leg shorter than the other and had been drinking heavily throughout the tournament was finally going to the final. And then he got sick. So he played it with a fever. And now we make it to the final. Brazil versus Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia's run to the final had been one of the great underdog stories of the tournament. Their goalkeeper, Willem Schroff, had collapsed in the tunnel after their very first match, was rushed to hospital and discovered to have been playing with an undiagnosed heart condition. He was lucky to survive. He recovered, came back, and carried an unfancied squad all the way to the final. Their captain was Joseph Masopust, a disciplined, intelligent, and veteran leader, the kind of player that makes everyone around him better. He'd go on to win the Ballon d'Or that year. He put Czechoslovakia ahead after 15 minutes, and the stadium fell silent. For 14 minutes, it looked like the greatest upset in the World Cup history. A country of 15 million people against defending champions winning a World Cup final. And then Amarildo equalized, the unknown replacement for the best player in the world, scoring in a World Cup final when it mattered most. In the second half, Zito scored, and then Vava. Brazil won 3-1. Schroff, who had been outstanding all tournament, made critical errors both for the second and third goal. The goalkeeper, who nearly died before the tournament and had recovered against all odds to reach the final, would ultimately break under pressure in the worst possible moment. This is one of the cruelest stories in World Cup history, and as someone with Czech heritage, is particularly devastating to me. And then there's Garrincha, who was unwell, having played with a fever and having nearly been suspended, was voted the best player of the tournament. He didn't score in the final, and he didn't need to. His work was already done. Brazil were world champions again. Back to back, baby. And what makes it even better is Pelé had not played a single minute of knockout football. One thing that gets lost in Garrincha and the Battle of Santiago stories is that Chile finished third, a country that earlier had been flattened by the most powerful earthquake in recorded history, that had reduced 8 planned cities into just 4, that had buried the man that organized the whole thing just 1 month before the tournament. They had gone into the tournament carrying a nation's grief and defiance. And then they beat Yugoslavia 1-0 in the third place match to finish third, their greatest World Cup result ever. Sanchez, the same guy who had punched a defender in the face, finished top scorer of the tournament with 4 goals. And ultimately, the country that had nothing did everything. Carlos Ditborn's words, the ones that he said to FIFA 6 years earlier to win the bid, were the unofficial slogan of the whole tournament. The stadium still bears his name. Interestingly, the main venue for this tournament was Estadio Nacional in Santiago. Built in 1938, its architecture was modeled on the Olympiastadion in Berlin, the same stadium where Hitler had hosted the 1936 games and where Adi Dassler had first outfitted Jesse Owens. For the 1962 World Cup, the cycling track surrounding the stadium was removed and replaced with additional stands, expanding its capacity to 95,000. It hosted the Battle of Santiago, the semi-final, the third place playoff, and the final. But there's something about this stadium worth knowing that has nothing to do with football. On September 11, 1973, 11 years after Brazil lifted the World Cup trophy on this pitch, Pinochet's military coup overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. In the days that followed, tens of thousands of Allende's supporters were detained. Within days, thousands were transferred to Estadio Nacional, and a week after the coup, an estimated 7,000 prisoners were being held there. Over the following 3 months, some 40,000 men and women were imprisoned in the same stadium. Over 100 men slept in the stadium's change rooms, constantly fearing being called out for special treatment. And the toilet block attached to the stadium was converted into a detention center where prisoners were tortured. The stadium is now a national monument and memorial. A human rights group leads tours of the building every Saturday morning where survivors tell their story. This was the same pitch where Garrincha beat England, the same stands where 66,000 people watched the Battle of Santiago, the same changing rooms. We've got Brazil doing it back to back without Pelé and with the man with the bent legs. And then the quiet story of Chile, the country that survived the worst earthquake in history, lost the man that made the tournament possible, and still managed to finish third. After the World Cup, Garrincha's fame grew, but so did his problems. His marriage fell apart, his knees got worse. He played on, but was a shadow of his former self. He found some stability with Elza Soares, one of Brazil's most famous singers, and a woman who had her own extraordinary story of survival and resilience. For a time, she held things together, but the drinking always won. He retired in the early 1970s, but without the structure of football, his life fell rapidly apart. He died on January 20th, 1983, with 100,000 people attending his funeral in Rio de Janeiro. The man who died with nothing had more people come to say goodbye than most heads of state. The next episode is England 1966, the only World Cup the hosts have ever won, a dog named Pickles, a controversial goal, and the country that invented football finally winning.